On January 30th, 1864, at a time when the American Civil War was dragging into its third year, exhausting the resources and morale of both the North and the South, the readers of Harper's Weekly, one of the most influential illustrated publications in the Union, a true opinion shaper in the homes of the Northern middle class, encountered a series of photographic portraits that would become one of the most potent acts of propaganda of the entire conflict. The images, published under the deliberately provocative and paradoxical caption, "Emancipated Slaves, White and Colored," featured a group of children and one adult, all recently freed from bondage in New Orleans. What made these images so electrifying and unsettling to the public of that era was not the depiction of slavery itself, but the appearance of the subjects. Many of the children, such as Rebecca, Charlie, and Rosa, possessed skin so fair, hair so straight, and features so distinctly European that, if seen in any other context, they would have been unquestionably identified as white. This was not a fortuitous publication. It was the meticulously orchestrated launch of a fundraising and moral persuasion campaign conceived by a coalition of prominent abolitionists from Philadelphia and New York. The stated goal was to raise funds for the newly established schools for freed people in New Orleans, a cosmopolitan and strategically vital city that had fallen under Union control in 1862. However, the underlying purpose was far more ambitious and radical. It was a sophisticated psychological warfare operation designed to dismantle the racial justifications for slavery, shock the Northern conscience out of its complacency, and force a profound moral reassessment of what it meant to be an American. The campaign surgically exploited one of the most brutal and contradictory legal truths of the American slave system, the doctrine known as Partus Sequitur Ventrem, or the offspring follows the womb. This principle, a perverse relic of Roman law that was adopted and codified in the laws of the British colonies from the mid-17th century onward, stipulated that the legal status of a child, whether born free or enslaved, was determined exclusively by the status of their mother. This was a cruel legal innovation, specifically designed to resolve the question of children born from the systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men, including masters, their sons, overseers, and neighbors. The law ensured that the offspring of these forced unions not only remained in bondage, but also increased the human and financial capital of the slave owner, who could be, and often was, the child's own biological father. With this doctrine, slavery in America became a hereditary and self-perpetuating institution, transmitted through the female body. By deliberately juxtaposing children of white appearance with an adult like Wilson Chin, whose dark skin and, more shockingly, whose forehead branded with a hot iron symbolized the explicit brutality of the system, the campaign's organizers created a visual spectacle that struck directly at the heart of the ideology of white supremacy. The message was visually irrefutable. Slavery was not the natural condition of an inferior race, but an arbitrary and corrupting legal construct that dehumanized all, dissolving the very racial boundaries that slaveholding society obsessively strove to police. These children were the living proof that the enslaved did not belong to a distinct biological category. They shared the same humanity, the same blood, as the white public who, stunned, viewed their photographs. Miscegenation, the great taboo, and the worst-kept secret of Southern society, was a source of immense anxiety and hypocrisy. Before the war, its fruits were confined to the plantations, invisible to the public scrutiny of the North. Now, through photography, a technology then celebrated for its supposed objectivity, its ability to capture truth without the artist's hand, a veritable pencil of nature, what was whispered in the master's quarters was proclaimed on the pages of the country's most popular magazine. The pale bodies of these children made the reality of sexual exploitation and racial inheritance a visible, palpable, and unquestionable truth for the entire nation. The strategic choice to use children as the face of the campaign was an act of propagandistic genius, tapping into the sentimentalist culture of the Victorian era. Instead of presenting the enslaved as adult figures who might be seen as resentful, angry, or potentially revolutionary, an image constantly evoked in Southern propaganda to instill fear in the North, the campaign focused on the innocents, purity, and vulnerability of childhood. It presented docile children with large, melancholic eyes, figures that evoked an instinct of pity and protection, not fear or revulsion. This approach created a much more palatable image of emancipation for a northern public that, while increasingly convinced of the immorality of slavery as an institution, still harbored deep-seated racial prejudices and fears about the prospect of a biracial society and social equality. The images also, in a calculated manner, tapped into the cruel stereotypes of the slave market. As detailed by historians like Walter Johnson and Nell Irvin Painter, characteristics such as frailty, delicacy, and a fair complexion were qualities that exponentially increased the value of an enslaved person, especially young women, the fancy girls, destined for sexual exploitation and more prestigious domestic labor in urban settings. In the innocent bodies of children, these qualities seemed natural, devoid of the artifice or moral complexity that an adult subject would imply, making the tragedy of their condition all the more poignant for a white audience. Furthermore, the campaign served a vital political purpose: to rehabilitate the image of the abolitionist movement. For decades, abolitionists had been caricatured as dangerous fanatics, whose uncompromising agitation threatened the unity of the nation and the sanctity of the Constitution. By showing these children as patriotic, some were photographed with the American flag, pious, their biographies emphasized their Christian faith, and above all, eager to learn, their progress in school was a central theme. The abolitionists repositioned themselves. They presented emancipation not as an act of social destruction, but as the first step toward the moral and intellectual regeneration of the nation. The message was that, with the legal end of slavery, the new and noble cause to be embraced was the education and uplift of these freed souls, transforming them into productive, self-sufficient, and Christian citizens, perfectly aligned with the ideals of the Republic. From the Emancipated Slaves from New Orleans series, a significant number of original photographic prints survive. To this day in archives and private collections, a material testament to their wide dissemination and the impact they made. The majority of these images were produced in the New York studio of photographers Charles Paxson and Myron H. Kimball, who captured the original group portrait that Harper's Weekly immortalized in its famous woodcut engraving. The choice of photography as a medium was not trivial, but a strategic decision that capitalized on the photomania of the Victorian era. In the 1860s, photography, and in particular the accessible and portable carte de visite format, was at the height of its popularity. These small photographic cards, the size of a modern business card, were relatively cheap to mass produce and had become a ubiquitous cultural phenomenon. People avidly collected them in velvet albums, traded them with friends and family, and purchased images of celebrities, political figures, and notable events. By turning the enslaved children into collectible items, the abolitionist campaign brilliantly utilized the social networks of the time to ensure its message went viral. The image of a child like Rebecca, with her alabaster skin and piercing gaze, could be found in photo albums in homes from Boston to San Francisco, sparking conversations, debates, and donations in parlors and living rooms. Each card sold not only raised crucial funds for the education of the freed people, but also acted as a silent, subversive pamphlet, a visual missionary for the abolitionist cause that penetrated the domestic sphere, a space often insulated from formal political rhetoric. But who were these children, whose silent faces became icons of a nation in upheaval? Harper's Weekly and the pamphlets that accompanied the photographs made sure not to present them as anonymous figures, but as individuals with names, ages, and devastating life stories. The biography of 8-year-old Charlie Taylor was a microcosm of the complex and cruel contradictions of the era. Described as having very fair skin and light and silky hair, the magazine article noted that 3 out of 5 boys in any school in New York are darker than he. Yet this boy, indistinguishable from his white peers, had been sold as a slave twice, the first time by his own father and owner. His story, however, did not end with the freedom found in New Orleans. It continued to expose the deeply ingrained hypocrisy of American society, even in the supposedly free North. Upon arriving in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love and a center of the abolitionist movement, Charlie and his protectors were summarily ejected from a first-class hotel because, Despite the evidence of their own eyes, the proprietor was informed that they were legally people of color and therefore undesirable. There was also the story of 11-year-old Rebecca Huger, who was a slave in her own father's house, a living and disturbing symbol of the systematic sexual exploitation that formed the bedrock of the slave system. And Rosina Downs, nearly 7 years old, whose father was fighting for the Confederate Army to preserve the institution that held his own daughter in bondage, while her mother, a bright mulatto, struggled to support the family in poverty. To ensure the message was not misinterpreted as a plea only for light-skinned slaves, the campaign strategically included Isaac White, a black boy of 8, whose biography described him as none the less intelligent than his whiter companions, a direct argument against the pseudo-scientific theories of black racial inferiority, and, lest the physical brutality of the system ever be forgotten amidst the sentimentality evoked by the children, there stood the austere and imposing figure of Wilson Chin. At about 60 years old, he was a living history book, his body a map of the cruelties of slavery. His biography told that he was sold to a Louisiana sugar planter, Volsey B. Marmillion, who was in the habit of branding his slaves like cattle. Chin's photograph was often accompanied by a detailed description of the instruments of torture he was forced to wear, but the most shocking evidence was seared onto his own forehead, the initials VBM, branded with a hot iron, an indelible testament to his status as property. His presence in the group portrait served as a dark and necessary counterpoint to the innocence of the children, reminding the public that slavery was not just an abstract matter of legal status or inheritance, but a daily reality of physical pain, degradation, and extreme violence. The juxtaposition of his scarred figure with the fair-skinned children created a complete visual narrative, encompassing everything from the implicit sexual violence in the children's appearance to the explicit physical violence on Chin's body. In retrospect, the photographs of the white slave children from New Orleans represent a historical artifact of immense complexity and power. They are a poignant reminder that slavery was a perverse and multifaceted system, whose injustices and contradictions transcended the simplistic dichotomy of skin color. At the same time, they are a masterful case study of the nascent power of visual media as a political tool, capable of shaping public opinion, awakening empathy, and mobilizing support for a cause in ways that text alone could not. These images forced America to confront a deeply uncomfortable and repressed truth. The line separating slave from free and black from white was not a fixed, God-ordained biological boundary, as the ideologues of slavery argued, but rather a fragile, arbitrary, and violently imposed social construct designed to maintain a structure of power. The stories of Charlie, Rebecca, Rosa, and Wilson, preserved by the silver emulsion of the camera and the ink of the press, continue to echo through time. They are a testament not only to the brutality of a system, but also to the resilience of the human spirit and to America's long, painful, and still unfinished journey toward the promise of true liberty and equality for all its citizens.